The sun was sinking behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the overgrown lawn. The air had a crisp chill to it, carrying the smell of earth and decay, as Emily and David's car rolled up the gravel driveway. The old mansion loomed before them, a dark silhouette against the fading light. The house was massive, towering over the landscape with an intimidating presence. Its stone facade, once bright, was now covered in ivy that crept up the walls like fingers trying to reclaim it. There were cracks in the walls, windows broken or boarded up, and the front door, although standing, seemed to creak with the weight of years of abandonment. Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she slowed to a stop in front of the house. It wasn't the first time they had seen the house, but it was the first time they were actually standing in front of it. They had been searching for a new start for weeks, looking for a place to call their own, far away from the busy city life. The house, despite its eerie vibe, had been too good to pass up. It was large, spacious, with a price tag that seemed almost too good to be true. But now that they were here, standing at its threshold, the reality of the situation was starting to set in. "Do you think it's too much?" Emily asked, her voice tentative, as she turned to look at David, who was staring at the house through the windshield. David didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the mansion, his face pale, as if something was weighing heavily on him. Emily could see the unease in his expression, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brows. He wasn't smiling, and he wasn't laughing either. For a moment, it felt like the world outside the car had fallen silent, leaving only the faint rustling of the wind and the soft hum of the engine. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "David?" Emily said again, this time louder. "What do you think?" He slowly turned to her, his face drawn tight. "I don't know," he said quietly. "There's something about this place." "Yeah, it's old, but that's kind of the charm, right?" Emily tried to brush it off with a smile. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt it too. The sense that something was off. The house looked like it had been forgotten by time itself, abandoned to rot and wither. And yet, here they were, about to make it their home. David still didn't say anything. Instead, he opened the car door, stepping out into the cool air. Emily followed suit, her boots crunching on the gravel as she joined him. She glanced up at the house again, and her stomach flipped. The mansion seemed to stare back at her, its broken windows like empty eyes, its decaying structure seeming to sag under the weight of its own history. As she walked towards the front door, Emily tried to convince herself that it was just the atmosphere playing tricks on her. They had seen worse, hadn't they? It was just an old house in need of some love and care. They'd fix it up, make it their own. It would be fine. But as they stood at the foot of the porch, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive in some way. It was as if it was watching them, waiting for them to step inside. She tried to laugh it off, but the laughter sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "You know, it's kind of grand," Emily said, trying to lighten the mood, her fingers brushing against the cracked, peeling paint of the front door. "I mean, it's a little spooky, but we could fix that. A little paint." some new furniture, and it'll be perfect." David didn't respond. Instead, he reached out slowly, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he grabbed the doorknob. The moment his fingers touched it, a coldness shot through him, an icy chill that seemed to seep from the door itself. It was as if the house was rejecting him. He pulled his hand away sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. "David, are you okay?" Emily asked, concern creeping into her voice. David shook his head, his eyes wide with a strange mix of confusion and fear. "It's just weird," he muttered. "I don't know what it is, but this place feels wrong." Emily frowned, her brow furrowing. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt it too. There was something heavy in the air, something that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The wind, which had been gentle moments before, suddenly picked up, howling through the trees around them. The house seemed to groan under the force of it, as if it were alive, its very foundations shifting. The feeling that something was watching them intensified, and Emily's skin prickled with unease. She glanced over at David, his face pale, his body tense, as if he were bracing for something. He was still staring at the door, as if waiting for something to happen. For a moment, they stood there, frozen, the silence between them thick and unyielding. "We don't have to go in," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. David finally tore his gaze away from the door, his eyes locking onto hers. "No," he said, his voice steady but low. "We came here for a reason. We need to see this through." With a deep breath, he turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The creaking sound it made as it swung on its hinges was loud in the quiet evening, echoing through the empty air. Emily hesitated for a moment, her feet rooted to the ground as a cold draft swept through the doorway. She wanted to step back, to run, but she couldn't. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong. It was something deeper, something buried beneath the layers of history and decay. She could feel it now, the presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. It was watching them, waiting. Together, they crossed the threshold, stepping into the darkness of the mansion. The door slammed shut behind them, with a force that made Emily jump. She turned, only to see that the front door was already closed, its massive wooden frame towering over them. The mansion seemed to swallow them whole as they stepped further into the foyer, and the air grew colder still. David took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes scanning the space. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the edges curling with age. The staircase leading to the upper floor was steep and shadowed, the banister cracked and weathered. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her every nerve on edge. "Let's just get the tour over with," she said, trying to push down the feeling of dread that was creeping up her spine. "We'll figure it out once we've seen everything." David nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, let's see what we've gotten ourselves into." They moved deeper into the house, unaware that their presence had already set something in motion. The house had been waiting. And now it would not let them go. As the evening stretched on, Emily and David wandered through the house, trying to familiarize themselves with their new surroundings. The kitchen was large, far bigger than anything they'd ever had in their old apartment. Yet something felt off about it. The countertops were made of marble, shiny but chipped in places, and the cabinets seemed to loom over them, their once bright colors faded and peeling. The appliances were outdated, rusting in some corners, while others seemed to belong to a different era altogether. As Emily opened one of the cabinets, a cold draft swept through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She quickly closed the door, but the sensation lingered. "Everything okay?" David's voice came from the doorway, breaking her focus. He'd been looking around the living room, which, despite its grand size, also gave off an unsettling feeling. The furniture was covered in dust, but it wasn't just that. The air felt cold in a way that didn't make sense for an old house like this. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from drafty windows or cracked walls. This was different. It was like the room itself was holding something within it, something cold and heavy. "I don't know," Emily replied, shaking her head as she turned to face him. "It just feels wrong, like there's something in here with us." David sighed, his expression tired. He had been trying to reassure her all day that it was just an old house in need of some repairs, nothing more. But as they continued their exploration, he began to wonder if maybe there was more to this place than either of them had imagined. The silence of the house was suffocating, as if it was waiting for them to make the first move. "Well, let's just finish checking the rest of the house," David suggested, his voice steady, though there was a hint of uncertainty in it. "It's probably just the old wood creaking or something." Emily nodded, though she wasn't convinced. The feeling of unease had settled deep in her chest, and she couldn't shake the thought that they were not alone. They continued their search through the house, making their way upstairs, where the floorboards groaned under their weight. The upper floor was dark, the only light coming from the thin beams of moonlight that filtered through the dusty windows. The hallway stretched on endlessly, doors to several bedrooms lining the walls. Emily stepped into the first bedroom, her eyes scanning the room. It was spacious, but the furniture was old, covered in sheets that had yellowed with age. The bed in the center of the room was large, its frame ornate, but the mattress sagged, as if it hadn't been slept in for years. As she moved closer to the bed, she noticed something strange. The sheets seemed to be pulled back, as if someone had just gotten up and left in a hurry. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping up her spine. David followed her into the room, and together they moved further inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. There was a mirror hanging on the far wall, a large, antique piece with an intricate golden frame. As Emily looked into it, she could almost swear she saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection. She spun around quickly, but the room was empty, save for David standing a few feet away, oblivious to the strange sensation she had just felt. "Everything okay?" David asked again, noticing the expression on her face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Emily replied, but her voice betrayed her. Her heart was beating faster now, and she couldn't shake the image of that figure in the mirror. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally made their way back downstairs. It was late now, the night completely overtaking the day. The house was still eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of the floorboards and the whisper of wind outside. They set up a makeshift bedroom in the living room, hoping that the size of the room would somehow make them feel safer. The couch was uncomfortable, and the blankets thin, but they were too tired to care. The unsettling feeling that had followed them throughout the house lingered in the air as they settled into the room. David lay down first, his body sinking into the couch, his eyes closing as he exhaled slowly. Emily followed suit, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The house seemed to settle around them, the silence pressing in from every side. For a while, they both lay there, wide awake, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Emily kept her eyes on the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the house's history, the strange feelings, the eerie quiet. She wanted to convince herself that she was overreacting, that the house was just old, that her imagination was running wild. But every part of her screamed that something was wrong. And then, just as they were about to drift off to sleep, there came a loud, sharp bang from somewhere deep in the house. It echoed through the silence, making the walls shake. Emily sat up immediately, her heart leaping into her throat. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. David shot up, his body tense. He looked around, his eyes wide. "It's just the house settling," he said, though his voice wasn't as sure as it had been earlier. But Emily wasn't convinced. The bang hadn't sounded like the house settling. It had been too forceful, too sudden. And it had come from somewhere deep in the house, not from the walls or the foundation. It had been like a door slamming or something heavy falling to the ground. David, trying to calm himself, rubbed his eyes and sighed. "It's fine, Em. It's an old house, you know. They make noises, especially at night." But Emily's gaze was fixed on the dark hallway leading back to the rest of the house. Something wasn't right. The noise had unsettled her, but it wasn't just the noise. It was what came next. From the depths of the house, faint and barely audible, a whisper drifted into the room. It was low, almost like a sigh, but there was something about it that made her blood run cold. "David, do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her heart racing in her chest. David froze. His expression shifted from confusion to something more wary as he listened. At first, he didn't hear it, but then the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, but it didn't sound human. It sounded like a soft murmur, a voice speaking in a language she couldn't understand. I don't hear anything," David muttered, but Emily could tell that he was no longer as certain as before. His eyes darted around the room, as though he too was beginning to feel the weight of the house pressing in on them. The whisper came again, louder this time, and this time, Emily was sure. It was a voice, clear, intentional, and far too close. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she looked around the room. "David, I hear it. I hear it, and it's not just the house." Her voice shook with fear as she grabbed his arm, urging him to listen. David's face had gone pale. He turned toward the hallway, where the sound seemed to be coming from, but the darkness beyond the living room seemed impenetrable. The house was vast, and the rooms beyond them seemed to stretch out into infinity. He looked back at Emily, his eyes wide with confusion. But there was something else there now, something he hadn't felt when they had first arrived. "Okay, I hear it too," David whispered, his voice trembling. "But it's just the wind. Or something. It has to be." But Emily wasn't so sure. The whisper was becoming clearer, growing louder, as if the house itself was breathing. It wasn't the wind. It was a presence, something watching them from the shadows, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. And as the whisper continued, she realized one horrifying truth. They were not alone in the house. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thick clouds, casting a muted glow into the house. The air was still heavy, as if it had been trapped in the old walls for years. Emily awoke to the silence of the mansion, the kind of silence that made every creak of the house feel like a shout. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of the whispering voice, the strange presence that seemed to follow her and David throughout the house. She tried to shake the feeling off, telling herself it was just the stress of moving into a new home. But something lingered, a feeling that gnawed at her every time she walked through the empty halls. After a quick breakfast, Emily decided to explore the attic. It was one of the few places in the house they hadn't checked yet, and she hoped that getting a sense of the entire house might help her feel more at ease. She climbed the narrow, creaking stairs that led to the attic, the wooden steps protesting under her weight. The door at the top was cracked open, and as she pushed it, dust flew into the air, clouding her vision. The attic was filled with old furniture, boxes, and piles of forgotten belongings. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the smell of must and decay was overpowering. It looked like no one had been up here for years. Emily stepped inside, her footfalls soft on the dusty floor, as she cautiously made her way through the clutter. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the forgotten relics of the house's past. There were old trunks stacked haphazardly in one corner, some with faded labels she couldn't read. A few old chairs were piled together, their cushions worn and faded with age. As Emily moved deeper into the attic, something caught her eye. A large, ornate mirror, partially hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. It stood against the wall, its silver frame intricately designed with swirling patterns and small, delicate engravings. The mirror seemed out of place in the dusty attic, like it belonged in a grander room, somewhere far more luxurious. Curiosity piqued. Emily walked toward it, brushing aside the heavy curtain. As she did, she noticed how the light seemed to change around the mirror. The glow from the window hit the glass in a strange way, making the surface seem almost alive, like it was pulling in the light and bending it. Emily hesitated for a moment, staring at her reflection in the dusty glass. Her face looked pale, tired, but normal. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface. For a brief second, everything felt still. The house seemed to hold its breath as she gazed into the mirror. But then, something shifted. Emily's reflection began to distort, the edges of her figure blurring. Her heart raced, and she stepped back quickly, but her eyes couldn't leave the glass. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't hers, not exactly. There was something standing just behind her, something dark, a shadow that was far too tall, far too thin. It was vague at first, just a silhouette. But then it seemed to sharpen. The figure was unnaturally still, like it was waiting for her to turn around. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded as she quickly spun around, her eyes scanning the attic behind her. But there was no one there. Nothing. The attic was empty, just as it had been before. No shadow, no figure, just dust and forgotten things. She quickly turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing. But the reflection had returned to normal. Her own face stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, like a frightened stranger. She stood frozen for a moment, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, an icy chill creeping up her spine. "It's just a trick of the light," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaky. Just a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She could still feel the presence, the weight of it pressing down on her. The air in the attic had changed, grown heavier, thicker, as if something had shifted within the house itself. She could almost hear the faint sound of breathing, like someone standing just behind her. But when she looked, no one was there. Her mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was the old house, the odd lighting, the dust in the air. But none of it felt real. The figure had been too clear, too sharp in the reflection. She had seen it, felt it, and now it was gone, leaving only the remnants of its presence behind. Without thinking, Emily backed away from the mirror, her heart pounding as she glanced around the attic. She needed to get out of here, away from the strange sensation that seemed to cling to her. As she reached for the curtain to cover the mirror, her fingers brushed against something cold, and she froze. It wasn't the glass. It wasn't the mirror. It was something else. A soft, muffled sound came from somewhere beneath the floorboards. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned her head toward the corner of the room. The sound was faint, but distinct, as if something was trying to make its way through the walls. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and took another step back. The sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her vision, gripped her tighter. She could feel the weight of it, pressing down on her, suffocating her. With trembling hands, she pulled the curtain back over the mirror, trying to shut it out, trying to block the image from her mind. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, curling around her like a dark cloud. She needed to leave, to get out of the attic. But something kept her rooted in place. Her thoughts were a jumble, her mind racing with too many questions. Who was that figure? Why had she seen it? Was it just her imagination running wild? Or was something really happening in this house? The air felt colder now, a biting chill that seemed to come from nowhere, wrapping itself around her body. She took one last look at the covered mirror, her pulse still racing, and made her way toward the door, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the attic. But just as she reached for the handle, she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. But the attic was empty, as it should have been. The whisper wasn't coming from the house, or the walls, or even the mirror. It was coming from her mind. The figure she had seen in the reflection, the darkness that seemed to move with her, it was following her. She could feel it now, inside her head, a whispering voice that echoed with a warning she couldn't understand. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own, and Emily stumbled back, gasping. She was no longer in control of her surroundings. The house had changed. The air was thicker, heavier, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Get out," it said, a voice she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Emily spun around, her heart racing. The attic door slammed shut behind her, leaving her trapped in the house. She felt a wave of panic sweep over her, but there was nowhere to go. The presence in the house, that dark shadow, was no longer just in the mirror. It was everywhere, and it was coming for her. As she stood frozen in the hallway, the house seemed to close in on her, its dark corners filled with things that were waiting, watching, and whispering. The figure, the presence, it was all part of something bigger, something that the house had been hiding for years. And Emily, for the first time since they had arrived, realized that they might never leave this place. Not alive, anyway. Emily sat at the small, creaky desk in the corner of the living room, her fingers tapping nervously against the keyboard. The house felt quieter today, almost too quiet. The strange occurrences that had started on their first night in the mansion were becoming harder to ignore. Every corner seemed to hold a memory. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a whisper from the past. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with this place, but she wasn't about to let fear take control of her. She needed answers. The old house had no shortage of secrets, and Emily was determined to uncover them. David had gone out to buy some supplies, leaving her alone in the mansion for the first time since they'd moved in. As she sat there, her mind raced with thoughts of the strange whispers, the shadow in the mirror, and the cold presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She needed to know more about the house, about its history. If she could understand the past, maybe she could figure out how to escape its grip. She pulled up the local library's website and began typing the name of the mansion into the search bar. At first, there was nothing. Just a few old real estate listings and a handful of articles about the area, all of which were decades old. She refined her search, digging deeper into the house's history. That's when she found it. A mention of the mansion in a local news article from the early 1900s. The headline caught her eye. Tragedy strikes at the Caldwell Mansion. Family found dead in their home. Her stomach churned as she clicked the link, a sense of dread washing over her. The article was brief, but it gave just enough detail to make her blood run cold. The Caldwell family, the original owners of the mansion, had been found murdered in their home. Each member of the family brutally slaughtered in their beds. The article didn't go into specifics, but it mentioned how the bodies had been discovered days after the killings, with no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no witnesses. The local authorities had never solved the case, and the mansion had remained empty for years, a dark reminder of the unspeakable tragedy that had occurred within its walls. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. She scrolled further down the page, her eyes scanning the text, desperate for more information. There were other articles scattered throughout the years, each one more unsettling than the last. The murders weren't isolated incidents. As she dug deeper, she found reports of other deaths tied to the house, some of them recent, others decades old. Each time, the families living in the house had vanished under mysterious circumstances, but their deaths labeled as unsolved murders, their fates left to linger in the shadows. One of the articles, dated just a few years ago, mentioned the house's most recent owners, a couple named the McAllisters. According to the article, they had moved into the mansion with plans to restore it to its former glory. But within a few months, they too had disappeared. The police had found traces of blood in the living room, but no bodies, and no sign of what had happened to them. Their disappearance had sparked rumors around town, but the case had gone cold, just like all the others before it. Emily's hands shook as she continued reading, her mind struggling to process the information. The house had a history, a dark history filled with death, violence, and unsolved mysteries. It wasn't just a house. It was a place where tragedy had repeated itself over and over again. The question that gnawed at her was why? Why had so many people died here? And what was it that bound them to this place, trapped in the house's dark embrace? As Emily continued to read, she found a disturbing pattern. The murders weren't random. They followed a disturbing sequence. Families would move into the house, thinking they had found the perfect home, only to be consumed by its dark power. The house seemed to feed on their fear, slowly eroding their minds until they were left hollow shells of who they once were. And then, just as it had happened before, the house would claim them, leaving nothing behind but empty rooms and a legacy of horror. Her mind raced as she pieced the story together. The house had always been cursed, bound to something darker than the stories could explain. The Caldwell family had been the first victims, But there were others, each one just as tragic, each one leaving its mark on the house. The murders were not just crimes, they were the result of something far more sinister. She sat back in her chair, her head spinning. The house had a name: the Murder House. It was no longer just a building to her. It was a tomb, a place where death lingered in every crack, every creaking floorboard, every whispered voice. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the oppressive darkness that seemed to fill the air. The house was alive with its own secrets, and now it had claimed her and David. She pulled up another link, this one from a local history blog that seemed to focus on the eerie aspects of the town. It was written by a man named Charles Wright, the local historian who had spent years researching the dark past of the Caldwell mansion. According to his article, the house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Samuel Caldwell. Caldwell had made his fortune in the railroad industry and had built the mansion as a testament to his success. But Caldwell's personal life was shrouded in mystery. According to Wright, there were rumors that Caldwell had been involved in dark practices, occult rituals, and dealings with forces beyond human understanding. The historian's article was filled with cryptic references to strange symbols found on the walls of the mansion and whispers of rituals conducted in the dead of night. Wright wrote that some believed the mansion had been built on an ancient burial ground, a place where the spirits of the dead had been disturbed. It was these restless spirits, Wright believed, that had caused the deaths that plagued the house. Caldwell, he suggested, had made a terrible bargain, one that had cursed the house for generations. Emily felt her stomach twist as she read on. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed that the house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was feeding on them, trapping them in an endless cycle of death and despair. And now, it seemed, she and David were caught in that cycle too. She closed the laptop with shaking hands, the weight of the history she had uncovered settling heavily in her chest. She sat there in the dim light, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled in the web of the house's dark past. She couldn't escape it. Not now, not after everything she had learned. The house had been waiting for them, just like it had waited for the others before them. And now, the house was hungry. Her eyes wandered to the hallway, where the shadows seemed to gather, dark and oppressive. She could feel it again, the presence, the weight of the house pressing down on her. It was watching her, waiting. The question was no longer whether she could escape. It was whether she could survive long enough to find a way out. Emily sat frozen for a moment, the horror of what she had uncovered sinking in. The house was a place of darkness, a place where secrets lived and died, and where the past was never truly gone. It would never let them go. The night was thick with a silence that was only broken by the occasional groan of the old house settling. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness of the room pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. The whispers from the night before had faded, but their memory clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She couldn't explain it, how it felt like the house was alive, or how she had begun to hear things when no one else was around. It wasn't just the wind or the house settling. It felt like something was in the house, watching, waiting. She turned to look at David, lying next to her. He was sound asleep, his face relaxed, but she couldn't help but notice how still he was, how completely unaware of the tension that filled the air. She tried to close her eyes, to drift off into sleep, but the unease gnawed at her. Every creak of the floorboards outside their room seemed louder than it should have been. Every whisper of the wind felt like it was brushing against her ear, trying to tell her something. Suddenly, a loud, sharp bang shattered the silence. Emily's body jolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't imagining it this time. This was real, and it was coming from somewhere within the house, deeper than before. A sound so violent, so unsettling, that it rattled her bones. A noise was followed by something else, a scream. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, raw, filled with pain. It echoed down the hallways, sending a wave of terror through Emily. She jumped out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a thud. She ran to the door, throwing it open, but what she saw next froze her in her tracks. The hallway was dark, but the shadows seemed to be moving. Figures, indistinct and shifting. Figures slipped in and out of the corners of her vision. It was like they were alive, slithering across the floor, curling around the walls. The faint light from the moon outside barely penetrated the darkness, but Emily could still see the silhouettes, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air in the hallway was thick, suffocating, and the temperature seemed to drop by the second. "David," she cried, rushing back to the bed. "David, wake up. We need to leave, now." She shook him, but he didn't respond. His body was rigid, unmoving, like a statue. His face was still pale, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the wall. They weren't blinking. They weren't even focused. They were empty, glazed over, like he wasn't even there anymore. "David!" Emily screamed, her voice rising in panic. She grabbed his arm, shaking him harder, but he didn't move. The voices were growing louder now, and it felt like they were coming from all around her, filling her head, crawling into her thoughts. She could barely hear herself think over the screams, the cries, the wails of anguish that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the house. Then, finally, his lips parted, and in a low, distant whisper, David spoke. "We're not leaving," he murmured, his voice barely audible, as if someone else was speaking through him. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. She recoiled from him, stepping back, her body trembling with fear. The way he said it, so calmly, so unnervingly, sent chills down her spine. His words didn't make sense. How could they be part of it? What did that even mean? "David, what are you talking about?" she shouted, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. This house, it's not safe. The voices, the things we've seen. This place is haunted. But David didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the wall, his body unmoving, like he wasn't even hearing her. His expression was blank, his lips curled into a strange, vacant smile. It was as if the man she had married wasn't even in there anymore. He was gone, replaced by something darker, something that didn't belong. Fear surged through Emily, and she took a step back, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the air thick with a malevolent presence. She turned and ran to the door, trying to escape. But as her hand grasped the handle, it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, but it was as if the house itself was holding her in place, trapping her inside. "David!" she screamed, her voice desperate. "Please! You have to listen to me! We have to get out of here! We have to—" Her words caught in her throat as she heard it again. The whispers. They weren't coming from the walls or the shadows this time. They were coming from inside her own head. The voices were louder now, clearer. They were no longer just faint murmurs or distant screams. They were calling to her. They spoke her name, soft and insistent, like a song, like a chant that echoed in her mind. "Emily, come closer. We're waiting. It's already too late." The hairs on the back of her neck stood up and a cold shiver ran through her. She turned toward David again, her breath ragged, her mind racing. He was still staring at the wall, still lost in his trance. His expression had changed. His eyes were wide and unblinking, but now there was a strange glimmer in them, a darkness that Emily hadn't seen before. The air around him felt heavier, like something was rising from within him, something dark and ancient. "We're part of it now," David repeated, his voice more forceful, more insistent. He slowly turned his head to look at Emily, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. His gaze shifted, settling on something behind her, something in the shadows. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. He was still staring at the shadows in the corner of the room, his smile now twisted. She turned and bolted from the room, running down the hallway toward the stairs. The house seemed to groan, its very foundation shifting beneath her feet. The shadows followed her, slithering along the walls, growing darker with each step. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape. The house was alive, and it was coming for her. The voices grew louder, more demanding, their words overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Emily, it's too late. You belong to us now. You can never leave." She reached the stairs and stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to make a decision: stay and try to save David, or run and never look back. But as she turned toward the living room, the answer was clear. There was no saving him. Not like this. Whatever had taken hold of David was too powerful, too deep-rooted in this house. "David," She cried one last time, her voice breaking. "I love you. Please come back." But the only response was the sound of the house groaning around her, the whispers growing louder, the shadows pressing in from all sides. She turned and ran, not looking back, knowing deep in her heart that David was lost. The house had taken him, just as it had taken everyone else before them. And now it was coming for her too. Emily's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she ran through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Every corner seemed to close in around her, every shadow stretching just a little too far. She had tried to keep it together. She had tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination running wild. But the events of the past few days, David's strange behavior, the whispers, the terrifying shadows, had pushed her to the brink. She couldn't stay in this house any longer. She needed answers, even if they scared her. She needed to know what was happening, what was taking control of her husband, and what force was haunting this place. Her mind raced as she sprinted up the creaky stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she ran toward the attic. It was the only place in the house she hadn't explored fully. The place where the strange mirror had been hidden. The mirror that seemed to show something more than her reflection. She needed to see it again, to understand it, to see if it could offer some explanation for everything that had been happening. Maybe it was the key to breaking whatever dark hold this house had on her and David. When she reached the attic door, she didn't hesitate. She threw it open and stepped into the dimly lit space, the familiar smell of dust and decay immediately enveloping her. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the mirror had stood the last time she had been here. The curtain was still drawn, hiding it from view, but Emily could feel the pull of it, the way it seemed to call to her, beckoning her toward it. She hesitated for just a moment before walking over and pulling the curtain aside. The mirror was still there, just as it had been before. Its silver frame was ornate, the intricate engravings glinting faintly in the low light. But something was different this time. The air around it felt colder, and the very surface of the glass seemed to shimmer with a strange energy. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. The chill that ran up her arm was unlike anything she had ever felt, like the glass itself was absorbing the warmth from her skin. She stepped closer, peering into the mirror, hoping that it would reveal something, anything, to explain the horrors she had been witnessing. At first, she saw nothing but her own reflection, her pale face staring back at her, her eyes wide with fear. But then, as her gaze lingered, the reflection began to change. The room around her began to blur, the edges of the mirror twisting and warping, as if reality itself was bending. She blinked and looked again, her heart skipping a beat. The reflection was no longer just her own. In the glass, she saw a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were distorted, their features twisted in anger and sorrow. Their eyes, oh, those eyes, were filled with rage, as if they were looking directly at her, accusing her of something. They seemed so real, so vivid, as though they were standing right there with her. The man's face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had seen something terrible, something that had broken them beyond repair. The woman standing beside him had a look of pure despair in her eyes. Her mouth twisted in a silent scream. The children were standing behind them, their small faces just as haunting. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, his mouth open, as if he was about to speak, but no sound came. The little girl stood next to him, her face streaked with tears, her hands pressed against the glass, as though she were trying to reach out to Emily. Emily staggered back, her breath coming faster now, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to pull away, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the reflection. The family's faces, so full of sorrow, so full of pain, were now starting to blur again, their features melting into the darkness of the mirror. But before they completely vanished, Emily saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. The man in the reflection smiled. It wasn't a smile of comfort or reassurance. It was something far more sinister, a twisted, hollow grin that stretched unnaturally wide. His eyes glinted with malice, as if he knew something she didn't. The smile was too wide, too wrong. It wasn't human. She gasped, her body jerking backward as the image in the mirror flickered. The family's faces faded, but something remained in the glass, something dark, something that made her stomach churn. A shape, a figure that seemed to loom behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty attic, silent and still. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was there, clearer than before. It was standing just behind her reflection, so close that she could almost feel its breath on the back of her neck. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure was tall, its form shadowed and indistinct, like a silhouette made of darkness. It stood still for a moment, watching her, before it raised a hand, a cold, skeletal hand, and placed it gently on her shoulder. The touch was ice cold, like it was made of the very chill of death itself. Emily froze, her entire body going rigid as she felt the hand press down, its fingers digging into her skin. A coldness seeped through her, spreading through her bones, chilling her from the inside out. She could feel the darkness seeping into her mind, trying to smother her thoughts, trying to pull her into its cold embrace. She didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed by fear, the figure's cold hand still pressing against her shoulder. The air in the attic grew heavier, the shadows seeming to grow deeper, more oppressive. The whispers from earlier, the ones that had haunted her dreams, grew louder, filling her head with voices she couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, The hand lifted from her shoulder. The figure in the mirror slowly faded, dissolving into the darkness. Emily stumbled backward, her body trembling uncontrollably as she reached out for the curtain, pulling it across the mirror with shaking hands. She couldn't look at it anymore. She couldn't bear to face whatever it was that had touched her, whatever had followed her into that attic. Her heart raced in her chest as she stumbled away from the mirror, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, one that led to something darker, something that had been waiting for her. Emily rushed down the stairs, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. She needed to find David. She needed to get him out of this house before it was too late. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, the house seemed to groan, the walls shifting and closing in around her. The whispers grew louder, their voices like a chorus, growing more desperate, more insistent. "Emily," the voices called. "You can't leave." The house was alive. It was hungry, and it wouldn't let her go. Emily felt as though the walls of the house were closing in on her. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being watched. It was all too much. She had to know the truth. There had to be an explanation for the terrifying events that had unfolded since the moment they stepped into the house. But the more she dug, the deeper the mystery seemed to become, and the more she realized that there was no simple answer. The house wasn't just haunted, it was something far worse. In a desperate search for answers, Emily began combing through old books, newspaper clippings, anything that could shed light on the dark history of the house. She couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. She needed to take control of the situation, even if the truth was something she wasn't prepared to face. Every night, she would stay up late, poring over the dusty, faded pages, trying to uncover some clue that would make sense of the madness surrounding her. It was late one evening when she stumbled across an old journal hidden beneath a pile of old, forgotten books in the attic. The journal was yellowed with age, its leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it carefully, the pages crackling with every movement. The journal belonged to Samuel Caldwell, the original owner of the house. At first, Emily wasn't sure what to expect. Perhaps it was just a personal account of the house's construction or some mundane details of his life. But what she found inside made her blood run cold. The first entry was dated just a few years after the house was completed. Caldwell's handwriting was neat but hurried, as if he were trying to write down his thoughts before they slipped away. His words were chilling. "I have begun to notice strange things in the house. At night, I hear whispers in the walls. Sometimes I feel as though I'm not alone, even though no one is around. It's as if the house itself is alive. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling grows stronger with each passing day. The entries became more erratic, the words disjointed as Caldwell's obsession with the house deepened. In later pages, he spoke of rituals, strange symbols carved into the walls, and the house itself becoming a place of dread. Caldwell described the house as a prison, a place where something dark was trapped, unable to escape. He wrote of sacrifices made to appease the entity within, but the more he fed it, the more it demanded. It hungers for fear, for pain. Caldwell wrote in one entry, "The house feeds on the souls of those who dare enter. It traps them, never allowing them to leave. They become part of it, lost in the darkness." What? Emily's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her heart sinking with each new revelation. The house had never been just a place to live. It was a trap, a prison for the souls of the murdered families who had once lived there. The souls were not free to move on. They were bound to the house, forced to relive their deaths over and over again. But that wasn't all. The house wasn't simply haunted by restless spirits. It was alive. It had a dark, insatiable hunger, and it fed on fear, anger, and the unwillingness to leave. The more someone resisted, the stronger the house became, drawing them further into its grip. Emily felt her stomach churn as she read further. Caldwell had made a terrible mistake, a bargain with something far beyond his comprehension. He had tried to contain the dark force within the house, but it had consumed him, just as it had consumed so many others before him. In the final entries, Caldwell's words were almost incomprehensible. His mind had been shattered by the horrors he had unleashed. His once pristine handwriting, now a chaotic scrawl. "It calls to me. I cannot." The journal ended abruptly, and Emily sat in stunned silence, the weight of what she had read sinking in. The house wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, feeding off the fear and suffering of those trapped inside. It had claimed Caldwell, and now it had claimed her and David. The house was not just a place of death. It was a place of torment, a place where the spirits of the past were doomed to suffer eternally, never allowed to move on. She slowly closed the journal, her hands trembling. The truth was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The house was alive, and it had been feeding on her and David from the moment they arrived. The voices they had heard, the shadows that followed them, the cold hand that had touched her shoulder in the attic. It was all part of the house's hunger. The house had trapped them, just as it had trapped all the others before them. They were part of its dark history now, unable to escape. But what terrified Emily even more was the realization that David was no longer the man she had known. He had been consumed by the house's power, just as Caldwell had been. The strange, distant look in his eyes, his empty gaze, it wasn't him anymore. He was lost, a prisoner of the house, and there was nothing she could do to save him. She was alone now, alone in a house that was alive and hungry. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its walls closing in around her. The air was thick with a sense of finality, as if everything was drawing to a conclusion. Emily had been hoping for a way out, a way to break free, but now she knew that there was no escape. The house had claimed them both, and it would never let them go. She could feel its presence, pressing against her, surrounding her. She could hear the whispers growing louder, the voices of the trapped souls calling to her, beckoning her to join them in their eternal torment. "We're part of it now," David's voice echoed in her mind, his words from that night replaying over and over again. She couldn't escape the truth. They were part of the house's terrible history, and there was no way out. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked around the house. She could feel its cold embrace wrapping around her, suffocating her. The house was alive, and it had won. Emily sank to her knees, her body trembling with fear and despair. There was nothing left to do but wait. The house had claimed them, and now it would never let them go. They would become another part of its history, another lost soul trapped in its dark, endless cycle. As Emily sat there, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth, she heard it again. The whispers, the cries, the voices of the trapped souls. They were growing louder, more insistent, their words merging into a single chant. "You belong to us now." And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never leave this place. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed David, and now they were part of its dark, eternal history, forever trapped in the murder house, unable to escape.